My name is Louis Jenkins. It is 30 July 2012. I am in Nashville, Tennessee. I am here this morning to interview my father, William L. Jenkins. This interview is taking place as part of the Legal History Project of the Tennessee Bar Foundation Fellows. What is your name?
Bill Jenkins.
And where do you live?
In Rogersville, Tennessee.
Who were your parents?
My father was Louis C. Jenkins, and my mother was Maud Ethel Wilson Jenkins.
Where did they live when you were born?
They lived in Detroit, Michigan. My dad was there. It was the Depression years, and my father had gone to, earlier in his life, he'd gone to Idaho and worked out there. He'd come back to Ohio and worked in the tire industry, and then he went to Detroit and was working in the automobile industry for Chrysler Motor Company, and I was born there.
Do you remember or know how long your parents had lived in Detroit before you were born?
No, I'm like the fella in South Carolina. I can't remember when I was born, and you can't either.
All right. What year were you born?
1936.
And at some point after 1936, did your family move back to Rogersville, Tennessee?
Shortly thereafter, I was probably less than 2, and we came back, and my dad started a business. He had a grocery store and a meat market and a slaughterhouse, and he later became a county official.
What was the job he held as a county official?
County court clerk.
And so that would have been roughly 1938 maybe, or 1939 when you moved
Yes.
back to Rogersville. And for those of people who aren't privileged enough to know this without having to ask, where is Rogersville?
Well, it's in East Tennessee. It's about 60 miles east of Knoxville, about 25 miles west of Kingsport. And Rogersville and Dandridge both claim the distinction of being the second oldest town in Tennessee. Jonesboro is unquestionably first, but Rogersville and Dandridge, one was settled first, the other chartered first, and so they both claim that distinction.
All right, let's talk for just a moment about about your grandparents. Who were the parents of Louis C. Jenkins?
Gail Jenkins and Rebecca Jenkins. And on my mother's side, Newt Wilson and Alice Wilson were her parents.
What was Newt Wilson's full name?
Isaac Newton Wilson.
And were all 4 of those people from Rogersville?
They were, but on my mother's side, on her mother's side, they were Johnstons. They still had the T in their name. They came directly from Ireland to Rogersville, Tennessee in about 1785. And John Johnston, our first ancestor on that side, was married to the sister of Joseph Rogers, who was already there and had come from Ireland, and the town was named for him.
For Joseph Rogers?
Yes, and on my mother's Wilson side, grandfather Wilson had come from Virginia in 1900, but he had, I've got hundreds of Wilson relatives back in Virginia, and our first ancestor to Virginia was served 27 years in the Virginia House of Burgesses, died in 1774. His name was John Wilson, and I have cousins who have speculation that if he had lived 2 more years, he possibly could have been a signer of the Declaration and or the Constitution from Virginia. But he was very active in the House of Burgesses.
Now, last May, when you and I, or May a year ago, in May of 2011, when you and I went to Washington, we stopped, I believe, on the way back, and now you're going to have to remember the name of the town where we stopped and looked at the grave of Colonel John Wilson, I believe.
Well, it's near Stanton, Virginia. I believe the little community is Middlebrook, and he earned that rank in the French and Indian War, and later served in the House of Burgesses, but led an interesting life, a pioneer life. At one point, his family was attacked, his farm was attacked, and some of his family killed, and one son was captured by an Indian tribe and taken away. And it took him about 2 years to gather enough men, arms, and ammunition to go raid the village and get his child back.
But he was able to do that.
He was able to do that.
So by the time you were born in 1936, how many generations of your ancestors had lived in East Tennessee?
I was, I guess, the 7th on both sides, on my mother's side and my dad's side.
Now, one of the salient features of my childhood was coming to the recognition at some point, I don't remember when it was, that your father, Lewis C. Jenkins, had died early in your life. When was that he passed away? It
was in February of 1943. And he had colon cancer. He was sick for about a year. He had surgery in Lexington, Kentucky, which was the nearest place at that time that did that kind of surgery.
And did your mother remarry after that?
7 years later, she did.
And who was the man she married?
She married Wayman Hurd, and he was originally from Hancock County and was one of 12 children. And of course, when my father died, my mother impressed upon us that we had to go to work, and so we did. And my first chores were to milk the cow, gather the eggs, feed the hogs, and help Granddaddy with whatever farm chores it needed doing.
And when you say Granddaddy there, which one are you talking about?
My grandfather Wilson.
Newt Wilson.
Yes, my grandfather Jenkins had died in 1928.
Before we move on, I recall a funny story about Newt Wilson and the first car that he obtained. Do you remember that story while we're...
Well, it was an A model Ford, and he had built a garage for it, and my mother was one of 10 children. I don't know how many of them were still at home at that time, but Granddaddy was over in a little meadow in front of the house, and he was practicing his driving, and so he finally decided he was up to par, and so he just drove it in the garage to leave it. But he didn't get it stopped, and he tore the whole back end out of his garage when he came in there.
Okay. What did he do, Newt Wilson?
He was a farmer.
What about his wife, your maternal grandmother was Alice Johnston Wilson, is that right?
Yes.
And what did she work outside her home?
With 10 children, she was a full-time mother and housewife.
What about your grandfather Jenkins, Gale Jenkins? What was his occupation?
Well, the Jenkins are Welch, and when they first came to this country into the coal fields in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, many of them mined coal. Now, my grandfather was a merchant, and he had a grocery store, and he had some other businesses. They had a livery stable, and they had a restaurant in Rogersville. But in his early life, he would, as many of them, many Jenkins did, and many other families, they'd venture back into the coal fields and mine some coal. My dad was born in West Virginia because Granddaddy was up there mining coal.
And what about his wife, Rebecca Clayman Jenkins? Is that right?
Yes.
Did she? What did she do?
Well, grandmother ran the restaurant principally. He was there, but she was really the operator of that restaurant, and it was a popular place. It closed before I was born because he had died, and then she later closed it and moved to California.
And I believe that you gave me a sheet from that the minister had, or a copy of a sheet that the minister had prepared from your father's funeral. I believe that your grandmother Jenkins lived in Los Angeles in 1943 when your father passed away. Is that right?
She lived there, but she came back to Tennessee and stayed with us for months, if not a year, or maybe even two, to help our mother.
And she later moved back to California.
She did.
And you have one sister, my Aunt Betty. Is that the only sibling that you have?
That is.
And later in her life, I believe Aunt Betty followed her grandmother to California. Is that right?
Well, she went to visit, and we had cousins there, and Betty was a school teacher, but she had only a 2-year certificate from ETSU, so she finished college out there, and during that time she met a young man, and they were married, and she lived in California until they moved to Arizona after his retirement from McDonnell Douglas Aircraft.
And she's in Oklahoma
She's now in Oklahoma because their oldest son has a business that is pretty much a national business, and that was a central location. So he moved to Oklahoma, and they followed to help care for his 6 children.
You told me that your father was elected to be the county court clerk. Was that his first foray into politics?
It was.
And how long did he hold that position?
Until his death.
And did your mother then take over and occupy that
She did.
job?
She was appointed by the county court to finish out his term, and was elected in her own right after that.
How long did she serve as the county court clerk?
Oh, I either 1 or 2 more terms.
And was that for Hawkins County?
It was.
Is that right? That would have been, let's say you told me that your father died in 43, so your mother was appointed to the county court clerk job in 43, and then were those 4-year terms?
They were.
So she served the remainder of his term and 1 additional term of her own?
It may have been 1. She may have served 2, but
Was it unusual at that point for a woman to be the holder of that office as the county court clerk?
Well, there had been there had been others, but she was one of the earliest office holders in our county who were women.
I remember her as a small child working at what we call the ASCS office.
The Farm Service Agency.
FSA now.
She did that later.
Did she go directly to that job from having been the county court clerk, or was there some intermediate job that she worked at?
I think there were 2 or 3 things that she did. At one time she worked for there was a grocery chain, Super Dollar, I believe was the name of it, and she'd worked there.
What about Wayman Hurd? What was his occupation, your stepfather?
Well, he was principally a farmer, but he did some other things. He sold farm machinery at one point in his life, but principally a farmer.
Was he ever involved in politics?
He was a county commissioner, or back then they were magistrates, for maybe a couple of terms.
Okay, and who is your wife, my mother?
She was Catherine Myers, and she was born in Johnson City, Tennessee. Her family, both her mother and father, were from Greene County, Tennessee. Her dad, John Myers, grew up in Mossheim. Her mother grew up in Greenville, Tennessee. And her mother was one of 6 children, and her dad was a dentist in Greenville, but her mother died at age 32 of one of the epidemics that killed lots of people around the country. And then her grandfather, or her father, died of a heart attack at like just a few years later. And so the 6 children in that family were principally grown, but they had to scramble to get some of the younger ones went to live with the older ones or other relatives.
When you were talking about her in those 2 sentences, you were talking about my grandmother and her parents, right? Not. So, where did you meet my mother?
Well, she had lived in Kentucky. She was born in Johnson City. I think she moved to Kentucky when she was about maybe 2 years old, or maybe even less. And her dad ran a commissary for a coal mine up there. And then in, I guess 1949, she came to Rogersville to live with an aunt and uncle. Her mother and father were divorced. And so I knew her there, and we had 1 year of elementary school left. We went all the way through high school together. We went to Tennessee Tech 1 year together, and then Catherine transferred to UT. And so we had never dated in high school or college. And when I came up to law school from Tennessee Tech, I was walking near one of the buildings where her sorority gathered. They had a room upstairs. They didn't have sorority houses in. And I heard this voice from above. I didn't know where it was coming from, called my name, and I finally looked up and saw her, and we talked a minute, and she said, well, if you need any dates, I've got lots of good-looking sorority sisters. And then about, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, she invited me to go with her to chaperone she was doing her student teaching at that time, to chaperone some dance. So she finally ran me down, caught me.
When would that have been? What year would that have been?
Well, we were married in June of 1959.
What year did you, we'll get to this, but what year did you come from Tennessee Tech to Knoxville?
The fall of '57.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go down the generations now. We've been going up for a long time. How many children do you have?
4.
And they are?
Rebecca, Georgianne, Louis, and Douglas.
And how many grandchildren do you have?
11.
Do you have any great-grandchildren yet?
No, but we're expecting one in November of this year.
And that grandchild would be my great-nephew,
Right.
the son of, it's a
Caleb.
boy, right?
Caleb Price.
And he'll be the son of Caleb Price, who is Georgianne's son.
Yes.
Okay. Are there any lawyers in the family besides you?
Well, there are 2 now. You and your brother, Douglas Jenkins.
All right. Let's go to let's talk about school for a minute. Do you what was the name of the place where you went to elementary school in Rogersville?
Rogersville City School.
Do you remember what your earliest desire was to be as a profession or a vocation?
I really don't. When I went away to college, I chose engineering, and I was an engineering student through my sophomore year. And then I decided to change to law school, or pre-law, and I did. And I was fortunate I didn't lose any credits, because all the engineering math and the engineering chemistry and all of those things were, could be used in my degree program.
Where'd you go to high school?
Rogersville High School.
Did you work during high school?
Well, I worked on the farm. We always worked. We worked year round, and I also my senior year I started to work for the Farm Service Agency and measuring crop allotments.
What kind of crops were you measuring the allotment of there?
Well, we measured, back in the beginning, we measured wheat, we measured tobacco, and then eventually the tobacco crops were the ones that we were measured. And I did that every summer in college, and one year I did it in Knox County when I was in law school.
I remember when I was a child, these tobacco allotments were done by pounds, where when you took your tobacco to the warehouse to sell it, they weighed it.
They were done by acreage. You were allotted perhaps an acre, perhaps 2 acres, or larger farms sometimes had 4 or 5 acres. But that's the way it was allotted, and farmers, depending on the weather and their own skills, the amount that was produced on that acre was sometimes very different. It might be 2,000 pounds, or the most I ever heard of was 4,000 pounds. And that poor fellow got checked by the authorities from all the way from Nashville, because they thought he might have had hidden patches out somewhere that he didn't allow the reporters to measure.
Did they check to see whether the measurers had any hand in the in the mismeasurement?
Well, they sometimes spot checked, and they sometimes, upon request, yes, they did supervisory work.
How did you measure the allotments? I mean, did you have survey equipment, or did you?
Well, you had a chain length of tape that was some sort of cloth that wouldn't stretch with metallic strips through it. It was 66 feet long, and so you just measured the chains and put them down, and then you drew the patch with a ruler on the back of the paper for that farm. And then they were taken into the central office, and they were calculated. The acreage was calculated.
What all did your family raise on the farm where you worked?
Well, we had cattle. We had beef cattle, and at one time we had registered Hereford cattle. We grew tobacco, and in the early days there were mills in Rogersville, and we grew both corn and wheat. Eventually, the spur railroad line that came into Rogersville was closed, and so the 2 mills that were there subsequently closed, and it pretty much dried up the market for locally grown corn and wheat, and so we then turned to cattle and tobacco.
What year did you graduate from high school?
1954.
Did you go immediately in the fall of 1954 to college?
I did.
Had anyone in your family that you know of been to college prior to that time?
Oh, yeah, there were some, of course, on my dad's side. My father was an only child, And my grandfather Jenkins was one of two children. And see, they were all gone, so I had no immediate relatives, but he had some distant relatives who had attended college. And on my mother's side, of the 10 children, let's see, there were 1, 2, 3 school teachers, and they had all 3 attended East Tennessee State University, and one aunt got a degree from the University of Chicago, and she was an educator there for maybe 40, 45 years.
You told us just a minute ago that you had gone to Tennessee Tech. What do you remember? What made you decide to go there instead of ETSU or UT?
Well, I can remember at that time, they probably still do it in another form, but the colleges recruited students, and the recruiter from Tennessee Tech, I thought, did a good job when he came and talked to our senior class. And we had several people from Rogersville had gone there. I had 2 good friends that were older than me, but Henry Price and John T. Walker were already there. And I'm sure they had some influence. John T. was a graduate in mechanical engineering, and we had been very close friends, and at one time close neighbors, and I'm sure that had an influence on me in getting into the engineering program. Henry then came to UT Law School, and maybe that was an influence on me to switch and go to law school.
Do you remember knowing any people who stick out in your mind who were lawyers growing up in Rogersville?
Well, you know, in Rogersville, it's a small town. We knew everybody. We knew the lawyers, and we knew their children. And I was not really close to any of the lawyers, but we had a very strong bar, and we had one of the people who had practiced law there was Judge Winfield B. Hale, who became a Court of Appeals judge in Eastern Tennessee, and later a Nuremberg justice at the end of World War II. And Judge Hale, incidentally, when I started to practice law, he was retired and had a small office in one of the bank buildings, and he loved to get young lawyers in that office and regale them with tales from his practice. And he was a very good lawyer, and wrote some really interesting opinions on the Court of Appeals.
I've got to ask you about this. I remember some pretty interesting stories, just vaguely, about your mode of transportation getting back between Cookeville and Rogersville. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Well, you know, I didn't have a car until my junior year in college, and I worked hard that summer and accumulated $250 and bought a little 1948 Ford. And so I drove it back and forth. But before that, you know, a bus ticket was, I don't remember how much, but it was pretty expensive for college students. So we used the old thumb, and we hitchhiked. And it was, you know, kids couldn't do it today, but it was a great way. We'd either have a jacket on with a school letter so that they could tell we were students, or we'd carry a little bag with the letter Big T on it. And but it was amazing. People would pick us up, families, you know, that were going on vacation or going home from vacation. Families from all over the country, they'd see you out there, and they'd stop and pick you up. And you know, lots of them would even, when they stopped to eat, they'd insist that you eat, and they'd buy you a meal. It was an interesting experience. course, it was sometimes dangerous too. I remember some occasions when, you'd get in and you'd discover that the guy had been drinking probably all afternoon, so you wanted to get out. And I had one particular experience. It was, I believe, the date was December the 18th, 1956, and I finished finals at 6 o'clock and was going home for Christmas. And there was a big snowfall. It was cold, really cold. And I sat out hitchhiking. There was about a foot of snow on the roads. They didn't clear them back then, and there was one track in the middle. And it took me 6 hours to go from Cookeville to Crossville. One man picked me up and took me to Crossville, and that's as far as he was going. And so I walked 5 miles out of Crossville. I later measured it on a speedometer, and but I thought I was going to freeze to death. I mean, it was really cold, and the wind was blowing, but finally I got a ride with a young lieutenant in the Army who was in the 101st Airborne Division. His father was retired Army and lived at Fort Bragg, or near Fort Bragg. He had a brand new Lincoln car, and he had a 10-day leave. He had a girlfriend back in North Carolina, and when his leave was up, he had to report back to Fort Campbell, and they were going to the Suez Canal. There was trouble then there, and we sent maybe more than the 101st Airborne Division. But at any rate, we sent troops there, and so this young man was in a hurry to get home, see his girlfriend, enjoy his leave, and the guy flew up that road to the point where I thought, good heavens, I'm never going to get home alive. And at one point I asked him if I could just get in the back seat. He said, I don't care where you ride. And so, but this guy he drove at speeds up to 90, 100 miles an hour on that slick road. But he finally got me to Knoxville, and where the road, the one fork of the road went to Asheville, North Carolina, the other to Kingsport. He let me out there, and I quickly got a ride home. But that's an experience that's gone from the world. Nobody can do it. It's dangerous for both the pedestrian and the driver of the car now.
The interstate I-40 didn't exist at that point,
No.
did it? So you did you come on 70 from Cookeville to
70,
Knoxville?
70 north to 11, and then home.
Okay, and so you already told us that you had switched from engineering to business, and then decided
Well, it was a pre-law.
go to law school.
Right.
Right. When did that change come about?
During my sophomore year at Tech.
So that would have been 1956, roughly?
Yes.
Do you have any recollection of why that shift occurred in your mind?
No, I've probably, when I mention my friends, that's as much of an indication as I've got. But I knew other people who were at the law school. And in high school, there was a murder case there that got wide publicity, and a fellow named Ray Jenkins, who was a Knoxville lawyer, had come and prosecuted that case. And he stayed in Rogersville at the hotel, and every morning he'd go over to the restaurant and order a big sirloin steak, and he'd have eggs, scrambled eggs with it. And he sat there, and he was a great big man, and would eat that steak and tell stories. And the school kids would get in a booth back here where he wasn't talking to us, but we could hear those stories. And so maybe that had that had an impact that I didn't even realize.
That's Ray Jenkins of the Terror of Tellico Plains
The Terror of
fame.
Tellico Plains. And chief counsel in the Army McCarthy hearings, and you know, a fellow with real prominence and credentials in the legal profession. And he was also an interesting human being. You know that in 1970, after the speakership, I ran for governor of Tennessee, and in campaigning in Knoxville, I went to see Ray Jenkins. And we could not establish that we're related in any way, but his law partner, Irby Jenkins, his family had come from Mountain City, Tennessee, and probably there's a distant relationship between us. But I campaigned with Ray, and when I got up to leave, he got up and put his big arm around me, and he said, "Son, if you win this thing, we're close kin." He said, "If you lose, I never heard of you."
Let's back up just one step and let me ask you. There's as I recall, and maybe my memory is not perfect, but as I recall, there was a way for you to go to law school and use your first year of law school and apply that as credit toward your undergraduate degree. Do I remember that correct?
Tennessee Tech and the University of Tennessee Law School had a cooperative program where if you came to UT Law School with all the required subjects for a degree, you could then take your first year law credits, send them back to that school, and they could be used as electives. And so you got a 4-year degree in 3 years. And that was, you know, that provided incentive for me to attend UT Law School.
Now, taking a year off that educational process might have encouraged me to be a lawyer. I did it anyway, but it might have encouraged me. So, did you know about that at the time that you decided to be a lawyer
sure.
or not?
Yeah, I mean, I went to UT Law School and talked to them about that, and you know, got all the particulars.
Now, were you able to go directly from your undergraduate, after you applied that first year of law school and got your undergraduate degree, did you go directly and finish the other 2 years of law school, or was there some hiatus there in between?
At some point, you mean during law school?
Well, yes.
Yeah, at some point I interrupted. I had 2 years and behind me and 1 year to go. And I had gone through the ROTC program. And so I had gotten married, and you know, I needed to save some money, and I needed some time out of school, so I accepted the Army, the orders to go to the Army, and did, and then came back and finished law school, finished the last year.
How long were you on active duty with those orders?
Well, with those orders, only 6 months, because the Army was they were in a period when they were cutting back. You know, this was well past Korea and well before Vietnam. And I went in 1959 and got out in March of 1960. But I stayed in the reserve program. I guess I had either a 4 or 6 year obligation, whatever it was. But it really didn't impact me because I've described myself as having a World War II mentality anyway. You know, I thought everybody was supposed to go to the Army. And in World War II, most of my relatives that were of age and able-bodied had gone. And I eventually spent 10 years in the reserve program and served in 3 reserve units. There's a log command in Knoxville. They had a slot for a military police officer, and I filled it. And there's a civil affairs unit in Knoxville. and I filled the military police slot there. And then I joined a replacement company because it was close to home. And we got alerted a couple of times, but never were called active duty during the Vietnam years.
What's a log command, just for people who
Well,
don't
it's
know?
a logistic command, and they're a backup support unit that provide all sorts of support for the infantry and the artillery and the people who are out there on the front line doing the heavy lifting.
Has your here we are, 50 years on or 52 years on from the inception of your Army service. Has your World War II mentality about people's service changed?
Not really.
I know the answer to this question. I could answer it without your help, I guess. But if some young person came to you today and asked you whether or not you recommended that they pursue military service, what would you say?
Well, for most people, I would recommend it.
Now, why do you say that?
Well, it's one of the things that we have to have. It's been true ever since we've been a nation, and it's true today, and it's going to be true in the future. And then too, we're so blessed that we need to give something back. We need to get out there and do our part.
Those orders that you had to active duty in the Army, where were you during that time?
Fort Gordon, Georgia.
That's in Augusta, is that right?
That's right.
Was my mother, was Catherine with you then?
Yes.
In Augusta? What did she do there?
She taught school.
Now, I've heard the stories about your bird dog, but I think one of your favorite pastimes is quail hunting. Is that right?
That's right.
Were you able to find places to hunt?
I was, and I met a fellow who became a dear friend who lived over in Aiken, South Carolina. My bird dog back in Tennessee had been run over by a county truck, and Catherine's uncle had given me a bird dog not fully trained, and I went out in search of bird dogs, and I found a fellow named Gaither Jones who had 7, and he was originally from Tennessee, and he was, he was a veteran, and he told me, he said, you don't need to buy any bird dogs, I've got 7, you just come and get one or all of them when you want a quail hunt. And so I took him up on that, and we hunted together a lot, but there were a lot of quail in Georgia and South Carolina both at that time.
Would you just drive up to somebody's house and ask them? I mean, would people just let you hunt if you just drove up and they didn't know you?
Well, he knew lots of people, but he also had a little poacher blood in him. That's the only time I ever got shot at when I was in the military was out quail hunting with Gaither Jones one afternoon, and he'd taken me to this place where he knew the caretaker was away because his vehicle was not at the small house where he lived, so he thought it was safe, and pretty soon the caretaker came home, and he fired about 50 rounds from some kind of a high-powered rifle, and they were just 4 feet off the ground, and so you talk about 2 fellas scrambling to get bird dogs out, and we got out of that place.
After you finished that 6 months on active duty with the Army, did you go back and finish your law school at
I
UT
did.
in Knoxville? When did you graduate from law school?
December 1961. Took the bar in February of 1962 and started a practice on April 1st, 1962.
How many days was the bar exam then?
Gosh, I guess it was 2, then 2.
Do you remember whether or not you thought it was difficult?
I remember that, both in engineering, I was not a great student. I learned to do what I needed to do to make some B's and some C's, and I did that, and then I did the other things I wanted to do. And I was pretty much that way in law school until I got married and the first child was born. And then I buckled down and became the last year in law school, Catherine taught school. I worked at the university, sometimes 8 hours a day, minimum wage, and took a full load and made some really decent grades the last year. But so that's another reason why I would recommend the military. People take on some responsibilities that are helpful to them.
Well, we've got your law license in your hands in 1962, and so maybe that's a good place to take a break, and we'll pick back up there with your first law practice.
Okay.
Well, it's 1962, and you have your law license in hand. Incidentally, do you remember how long it took for the bar results to come back?
Well, I took the bar in February of '62 and started to practice April 1st, so it had to be between that time, probably up close to April 1st.
Okay. Where was your first law practice located?
In Rogersville, Tennessee.
Did you even give any consideration to going somewhere else to practice law besides Rogersville?
I did, and I looked at some places and some firms and some businesses, and but I decided that that was home. That's where I knew people, and I thought my prospects were better there.
What was the first office you went to work in, or did you open your own office? Did you?
No, I was recruited by a lawyer who was a World War II veteran, who had been practicing since right after the end of World War II, and he proposed that we establish partnership, and we did, which was. It would be very unusual today. It was not really that unusual back then, I suppose. But I was very fortunate because he was what we all called a lawyer's lawyer. He didn't want to be a judge. He didn't want to be in the legislature. He loved the practice of law, and he read the advance sheets. I don't guess people do that anymore, though. The way some read the Bible, and he had lots of little sayings that I remember. People would come in his office and they'd say, "Ed, I read in the paper something that was going to affect their business," and they were all concerned about it. And Ed said, "Look, you don't," and they'd say, "What do you think about that?" or something. He'd say, "Look, I don't practice law out of the newspaper. Practice out of these books back here." And he'd point to the reporters and the TCA and all those things.
What was his name?
Ed Hyder.
How long were you and Ed together in this partnership?
We were together until 1970, when in about 1966 we'd taken on another partner, so there were 3 of us. The firm was originally Hyder and Jenkins, and then it became Hyder, Jenkins, and Boyd. And in 1970, when I got ambitious to be the governor of the state of Tennessee, I resigned from the law firm because I saw, to begin with, it was going to just absolutely devour all of my time that year, and I thought it unfair to them for me to be out campaigning, although they might have tolerated it, and probably would have, but I thought it unfair to them.
What did you and Ed do? What kind of work did you do?
Well, he had a really varied practice. At the time I went there, he represented a couple of banks. We did their title work and other work that they had. He did a lot of personal injury work and both plaintiff and defense. And he represented two insurance companies, I guess, when I first started. But it was really a across the spectrum sort of practice. We did everything that we could do and felt comfortable with, in a town that small and without the backup that you needed for some things. And we did a lot of estate work. I did a considerable amount, and he had before, of criminal practice. And of course we did lots of domestic relations in those days.
You mentioned another lawyer coming in, and you mentioned that the name of the firm changed to Hyder, Jenkins, and Boyd. Who was that lawyer?
Larry Boyd.
And I believe he's still in practice in Rogersville. Is that right?
He is, and his son has recently joined him in the practice law.
Now, how long was it from the time you walked in and set up your office with Ed until you tried your first trial involving a jury?
Well, I can't remember the exact date, but it was just a few months, and I'd have to go back and look at the court docket. But I know it was a matter that was really challenging to me, and I tried to get Ed to go with me, and he said, no, if you're gonna be a lawyer, if you got to try lawsuits, you're gonna have to get in there and start trying them. And so I got ready, and it really was an interesting case. And I represented an elementary school principal, and she and one of her students had left the schoolhouse, and they were going up a long hill, and a car had passed. And it had two occupants. They were from out of the county, and but the cars met, and she and her car was knocked over into the ditch, and she was injured, and her student was injured. And their story was that they were just driving along in their lane, and the other car had just pulled back in too quickly, and the other driver's story was that she had veered left and hit him and then slammed back into the bank. So there were two witnesses on each side. I think I probably had an advantage because they were nearing the top of a hill, and it would have made more sense for the car to have pulled back in quickly. But at any rate, on the other side of the lawsuit, there were two lawyers with a total of 75 years of law practice under their belt. And one was Tom Rogan, who was really a great lawyer, and he had the best personal injury practice in our county at that time. And the other party's insurance company was regularly represented by Mr. Howard Jarvis of Knoxville, who was the father of Jimmy Jarvis, later the federal judge. And so I was able to try that. It took all day to try it, and I was able to prevail. And it was, of course, a great feeling for me to be able to win that case, and especially with the opposing counsel that I was up against. And so the next day, Jimmy Jarvis, I'd been in law school with Jimmy, and he called me and he said, "What the hell did you do to the old man up there yesterday?" And I asked him what he was talking about. He said he came home all grumpy and said that he and Tom Rogan had practiced law for 75 years, and some guy who'd just been practicing a few months beat him in a jury case up there. So it was a good beginning.
Now, there were no rules of civil procedure, right, when that happened.
Right.
They hadn't come into effect yet. So, how did you get your case ready for trial? It might seem impossible to somebody like me who's never known anything else but the rules of civil procedure. But how'd you get your case ready for trial?
You interviewed every available witness, and you hoped that you didn't get ambushed at the trial. But in this case, we had a really interesting situation in that somebody called the highway patrol, and I don't remember all the particulars, but this fellow who was a highway patrolman, he was due to get off at 4 o'clock or something, and that's about the time he got the call, and so he didn't go investigate it. And I think he later went and tried to do an investigation. And so he didn't want to apparently be involved in it, so he was a grumpy witness for everybody. And I interviewed him and I think got the best of him at the trial was interesting.
Now, when you started practicing law there in Rogersville, you mentioned that you did criminal defense work. Was there any system like the public defender's office or anything that regularly represented people?
There were no public defenders, and the entire bar was subject to being appointing to represent indigent clients.
Now, this is one of my favorite things. So tell us how that happened. How the appointment process happened.
Well, you would get a call from the clerk to come. The criminal judge was in town and was making appointments, and you would be called to come down and take your appointments. And I remember on one occasion I was called down. Judge Smith had appointments. The other lawyers were called too. He gave me mine, and I asked him when we were going to determine when the trial date would be set. And to my great surprise, I think I got 3 or 4 appointments that afternoon. And when I asked about the trial dates, he said, Mr. Beard's trial will be at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And so I scrambled around and asked about witnesses. He said, if your client has any witnesses, said, you give me their names and I'll order an standard subpoena, and we'll try this case. But it was much, in today's world, there'd be litigation over that probably that went on for months and years.
What all counties were in the judicial circuit where Hawkins County was located at that time?
It changed. They changed, and I can't remember the exact year, but our circuit judges were in Sullivan County and Hawkins County and Greene County and Hamlin County. And then that changed, and the Sullivan County, which was a much larger county, eventually had their own set of circuit judges, and Hawkins was in a district with Greene, Hamlin, and Hawkins.
And how often would the judge...
And Hancock was added to that at some point.
How often would the judge be in town?
Well, they set the dockets, and generally each judge would be there 3 times a year, 4 times a year.
For how long?
Well, it depended on the docket, but usually they were there for a month. One judge would be there in February, again in June or July, and again in the fall, October, November.
Did you, when you had one of these criminal appointments, before you went to trial, were you told who the state was going to call as a witness?
Well, you might you might be able to determine that. I mean, sometimes you of course could talk to the district attorney, and sometimes you'd find out from your client, or you generally knew, but there were surprise witnesses and there were ambushes.
How frequently did that happen?
Well, it depended, I guess, more than anything on the magnitude of the trial and how important it was and how serious the offense charged was.
Do you remember any of the judges who were in that circuit during that first stint you had practicing law from 1962 to 1970?
Oh, sure. I remember him. Our circuit judge was John R. Todd, and he was from Kingsport, Tennessee. He had been a very able trial lawyer with a great reputation, and he was a good judge. But he did, I think I can say without speaking in error, that he did have things that he liked and he had things that he disliked greatly. And you had better know what those things were.
Any others? Any of the other judges?
Well, Judge Smith was the criminal judge, and he had been a prosecutor and moved on to the judgeship, and I suppose again I could say, and I doubt that if he were alive he'd deny it, but I think he definitely had a tendency to be in favor of the prosecution, because that's what he'd spent a lot of years doing.
Well, you told me a story about another thing that you handled, which was a smaller case and didn't involve a jury, but maybe there's a lesson in that for new lawyers, about a lady who had lost her rug in a move from Washington to Rogersville. Do you remember that?
She came to my office. She was the widow of a Navy admiral, and they had been, in the course of his military career, all over the world, and they'd accumulated lots of things that were, unique and of value. And when he died and she moved back, she was originally from Rogersville. When she moved back, the Mayflower moving van company lost her Oriental rug. And so she employed a Washington, D.C. law firm, and it was a big firm and had lots of lawyers, but one day, she was also our landlord. She owned the building in which our law office was, and she came in, and here I was in my little bitty law office that we had made for me, cut out of a much bigger room, and she sat down and said, "Mr. Jenkins," she told me the story and said, "Do you suppose," "I've got this big law firm up there and they have not recovered for my rug. Do you suppose you could?" I said, "Well, in my infancy in the practice, I knew enough to say, well, you've got a lawyer, so I can't get involved in it." She said, "Well, I'll take care of that." And so she called immediately up to Washington and told the law firm that, and I'm sure they were glad to get the call, but that she did not want them to represent her any longer, that she was going to hire me. And so, but it had gone on for months and months and months. And she'd call and make calls, and nothing ever happened. And so when when I was cleared to represent her, I said, well, listen, I said, did they ever sue this company? She said, no. And so that very day, I filed a complaint to recover that rug, and within just a few weeks, I mean a very few weeks, I had the Mayflower people and the insurance companies and everybody, and I'd recovered the price of her. I recovered the maximum that I filed it in General Sessions Court, and I recovered the maximum amount that you could recover in General Sessions Court at that time. And so she became a real grateful client, and was responsible for, getting me clients of all kinds after that. And she was very talkative, and she'd go through town telling about how much better these East Tennessee country lawyers were than those big city lawyers.
What's the lesson there for young lawyers who are just starting out?
Well, I think the lesson is to take the bull by the horns, and if it is warranted, file a suit and get it over with.
Okay, well, let's see. What about the bar, the Hawkins County bar, in that first decade of your practice? What are your recollections or impressions that you still have from the Hawkins County bar during that decade?
It was a very strong bar, and historically, the bar in Hawkins County had been strong. The first lawyer of any real prominence was in East Tennessee, was in Rogersville. It was John McKinney. He had come from England as a minister and became a lawyer, and he was very successful, and from that time on, there was it was pretty much a center. It was right there on the Holston River, and the westward migration came down that river principally, or just across the hill down the Clinch River. And but there were lots of families that stopped off there, and later went on. I was amazed when I got to the Congress when I found a member with a name similar to the names in East Tennessee. I'd quiz them, about whether they could be kin to the people back in East Tennessee. An amazing number of people said, yes, my family was, and a couple of them said Hawkins County, Tennessee, and back in the 1800s, and they didn't stay long and moved on to Indiana, Texas. One from California, whose family had come from Middle Tennessee. But the Bar Association had been strong, and at the time, there was my law partner Ed Hyder. There was Winfield Hale Jr., the son of Judge Winfield Hale. There was Tom Rogan, Eastman Portram, whose father had been a Court of Appeals justice for East Tennessee, and Jay Mays, who later became a criminal judge. And but they were good lawyers. They were competent. They were ethical, and they'd fight you tooth and toenail, but they were going to they'd tell you on the front end, that if they were going to whip up on you in a lawsuit. But they were, but you could, there was much more civility, I think, than exists today. And if a lawyer needed more time to file a pleading or something, it was good enough without, having a written memorandum or a name on a piece of paper. We would just agree, and it got done, and nobody ever backed out. Can't ever remember a time when there was a dispute about that.
How many total members of bar in Hawkins County were there in that decade?
Well, there were probably, and Henry Price was back there by then. There were probably 10 or 11.
Pretty soon after you started practicing law, you ran for the legislature, didn't you?
I did. I was recruited again. We had a direct representative for Hawkins County, Tennessee, and the legislature had gone through reapportionment, redistricting, and there was a newly created seat for Hawkins County, Hancock County, and Granger County. And the direct representative from Hawkins County encouraged me. He was a businessman there, and he encouraged me to run. And he had other people to encourage me, and eventually I talked it over with my law partner, and he gave me his blessing to do that. And so I ran in 1962 for the seat from Hawkins, Hancock, and Granger County, and was elected.
You had told me how much money you raised, and I was astounded. How much money did you raise for that first election?
Well, I wouldn't say I raised any, but the direct representative, who was Mr. Hugh Bowles, and I think a couple of his business friends, they gave me $250 and said, if you need more money to run your campaign, you let us know. Well, I had some cards printed up, and I don't remember how much that cost, and I put some little ads in the newspapers, but principally I went out house to house, door to door, business to business, and just did personal campaigning. And when the campaign was over, I think I had $41 left. And, I went to them and tried to give them the $41 back, and they thought I had to be pretty crazy.
Did you have an opponent in the primary?
I did, and my opponent was a dear friend that I had gone to UT Law School with. He was from Granger County, Tennessee, and he was he's a very capable lawyer, and he was a wonderful campaigner. I mean, he really was great, and we just duked it out.
What was his name?
Creed Daniels.
And did you have an opponent in the general election?
I did not.
So for anyone who's familiar with the politics of the state of Tennessee, it won't come as any surprise that was the Republican primary in which you ran in 1962.
In that part of the state, yeah, there would be no surprise.
Historically, in your family, had there been anyone associated with any other party that you remember in sort of in your lifetime?
Some that I remember. Both my grandfathers were Democrats, and my mother was one of 10 children, and initially they were all Democrats, but they're all gone now. But before they left, there was only one of them who remained really loyal to and active in the Democratic Party. But he was in World War II, and he came home at the end of World War II and founded a funeral home in Churchill, Tennessee. And when I would have a campaign, he'd get out and work for me. And he once told me, he said, "I'm getting damn tired of working for you in Republican primaries." He said, you're going to have to run as a Democrat if you want me to keep helping you. But it was a good situation to, at family reunions, we had all sorts of discussions. My dad had become a Republican. My mother became a Republican, and I guess my dad's mother's people had my great-grandfather on that side had come from Virginia in 1859. He had left a pretty comfortable situation up there. His family were considerable landowners, and of course he lived until I was he died long before I was born, but his son lived until I was 9 years old, my great-grandfather. But it was part of the family lore that he had seen the Civil War coming on, and so he moved to Tennessee, where the climate was much more favorable for him, and eventually he served in the Union Army. He left Tennessee and went up in Kentucky, where the Union Army was recruiting. But it really, the politics of that region, and especially that congressional district, they really go back to the Civil War. The 12 counties in East Tennessee that I later represented in the Congress, they supplied more soldiers for the Union Army than they did for the Confederate Army, even though Tennessee had seceded.
So you were elected into the Tennessee House of Representatives in that election in 1962. What did it feel like to walk into the House chamber for the first time as a brand new representative?
Well, I had a thing happen to me. I was 24, I guess, by the time I got down there, and literally everybody said I looked 17 or 18, and when they gave us the keys to, each member had a desk. I think mine was number 75, and you given a key, and so you go down and they've got some things in the desk for you to some things to fill out and some things to read. So I went down and started to get in my desk, and this lady who worked there in the clerk's office came up and said, "Young man," said, "only members are allowed in those desks."
How long did you serve that in the legislature after being elected in 1962?
4 terms until 1970.
Do you remember any of your early committee assignments?
Well, I bounced around from committee to committee. I was on various committees, but I guess in my third year, or in my third term, we changed all the committee assignments. We went from a system of 21 committees down to a system with 7 committees. And so the year I was elected speaker, we had gone to the new committee. Some of the old ones were obsolete. Some of them had little or no business. And so we tried to streamline it, and did. And we had 7 committees when I was elected speaker. And at some point, I hope you're going to ask about the atmosphere that existed, especially with respect to civility. And let me tell you, when I was elected speaker, I was really, I sometimes say, the only straight Republican, the only Republican that had ever been elected speaker. Prior to that time was a fusion party. It had 2 names in his party affiliation. And so there were 49 Republicans and 49 Democrats and 1 independent. And I got all 49 Republican votes. I got the independent vote, and I got one Democratic vote and won 51-48. And the Democratic vote that I got was Bob Booker, who was from Knoxville, and he was the only Democrat east of Knoxville. And I think I'm correct in saying that Bob had been a Republican, and I think he once was the chair of a young Republican club out in East Knoxville. But Bob voted for me, and the independent, Mr. J.P. Kimbrell, voted for me, and I was elected Speaker.
And that was what year?
1969, January of 69.
And how long did you serve as Speaker?
69 and 70.
I'll go back and ask you about the question you hoped I would ask you. What did you were later in the legislature, again in the national legislature, but in the state legislature in those 8 years from 62 to 70, what was the atmosphere like sounds like it was pretty evenly divided some of the time between Republicans and Democrats. And what was the atmosphere like in that?
Well, you mean in all 8 years from 62? Well, it wasn't evenly divided to begin with. There were 17 Republicans when I went there, and the rest of the 99 members were Democrats. The second term, there were 24 Democrats or Republicans, and then at some point, the decision in the Supreme Court of Baker versus Carr was decided, and it brought about the proposition that one person could only have one vote. And so in the metropolitan areas of Tennessee, Shelby County, Davidson County, Knox County, Hamilton County, the parties would just nominate and elect a slate of legislators. And Baker versus Carr required those metropolitan areas to be, instead of running at large, they had to be divided into districts. And so after that decision, we had 41 members, and then in the fourth term, during my fourth term, we had 49. So Baker v. Carr was one of the things that brought about that transition, that change in the legislature in Tennessee. And of course, Howard Baker was elected as the first Republican to the United States Senate by popular vote in 1966. He had run in 64, was defeated. Bill Brock had come on the scene, was in the Congress, and we had people who were very active and being elected. And
did you continue to practice law that entire 8 years that you were in the legislature? How'd you manage that with being away from January through May? Or
well, it was manageable by primarily through the good nature and the ability of my law partner. He was one of a kind who would, willingly step up, but of course it benefited him as much as me, because he, if I had a case, he got a much bigger share of the proceeds of the fees than I did at that time. But he was very good, and also the judges. I never. Judge Todd particularly was not, if he had a docket setting, he did not want to hear, Judge, I can't be there on that day. If he said, we're going to set your case for such and such a date, then my standard response was, yes, sir. And but occasionally, you could work the docket to some extent, because the legislature met. Generally, you were out by May or June, in the first year of the session, and then you were out earlier than that in the next. So my terms of circuit court were in March, July, and November. And you could pretty much get some cooperation from opposing counsel and the judges, to get them set in July term or the November term, and that was helpful.
Now that was in the '60s, as we talked about before, when we talked about you going back and forth from Tennessee Tech. I take it that the interstate did not exist. The I-40.
When I started traveling to Nashville, the interstate did not exist. And during those 8 years, there were portions of it that were open, and but you had intermittent interstate. That's what you had. And you had long stretches of connecting road.
Long drive, a lot longer than the 4.5 hours it is now.
Well, when I first started going to Nashville, you had to go through Knoxville. You had to go through several smaller cities, and you had better allow about 7.5 hours to get to Nashville from Rogersville, Tennessee.
So what was it that you liked that kept you going back with that rough trip for those 8 years?
Oh, it was just to go there and be there at that age, and to have and to see all the changes that were made, and I think improvements, and to see an era of legislative independence. Previously, and there were some things good about it, but previously the legislature had been pretty much dominated by the executive branch of the government. And I mean, that's not and I've said many times that was not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it was not a good thing. And to see those changes, they were monumental in Tennessee government. But I saw the change from one party to a two-party system, which I think has benefited us.
So how was it that you came to be the candidate for the Republican Party for the speakership in January 1969?
Well, there were 49 of us, and I had an opponent from Knoxville, I had an opponent from Nashville, I had an opponent from West Tennessee, Huntington. So we, all of us collectively, we covered the state pretty much like Dew covers Dixie. But I had an advantage because there were more members tucked up into that little eastern section of Tennessee. And so, and I had served, I had been the minority leader and had handled some legislation that, involved elections and things like that. And I guess that there were lawyers among us, but I guess at that time they felt like that I could probably do as well, on the floor and managing legislation as anybody could.
How often during that year, well, it would have been 2 sessions, the first session in January through May of '69, and then the session in 1970. Is that right, 69 and 70?
Mm-hmm.
How often were you actually in the speaker's chair when the House was in session?
Well, basically all the time. And let me tell you, it was it was certainly not like the the Congress, and the speaker's chair was a real challenge for me to take over with a sharply divided House, and there was no parliamentarian. Our rule book was about yay thick, and so I memorized that rule book and had to meet each challenge on my own that came up, and you know, there were people in the legislature who prided themselves on you know, using parliamentary moves to, you know, to get their desired goal. And but it was a very tiring job because I had to be there. I was there when the House was in session. I was on the dais as speaker.
Well,
and I can remember taking breaks. I would go in at if we were in session all day and we'd take a break. I remember going in, and the lady who worked for me would keep all the doors. We had an office. The speaker had an office just outside the House chamber, and she was very good about letting me go back there. There was a red carpet on the floor, and it was soft, and I'd go back there and nap for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and jump up with the red wool from that carpet all over me, get brushed off, and head back to the speaker's chair.
Well, we're about to make a transition from your speakership to the rest of your service as a public servant. So maybe it's a good time for a short break, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
Well, we've gotten you into the speaker's chair, and we're about to make the transition into 1970 into the governor's race. But before we do that, we're going to recap. So you were practicing law, and by 1969, Doug was born, so you had 4 children, and you were driving from January through May down and back to Nashville every week.
Right.
Did you? And farming and practicing law.
Right.
Were the days longer than 24 hours in 1969 and 70? Was there some slowdown in the Earth's rotation that caused things to?
No, but I tell you, there was. I had a lot of good help. As I mentioned, my law partner. My stepfather was very helpful, and we had some people who worked for us on the farm, and they were very good. And so, but I did learn a valuable lesson, and that was that when I got that busy, that time, you just could not waste time. And so I had to, on my own, learn to use my time wisely and not waste it. And it's amazing, you know, I never took the time and motion studies in school in any subjects or anything, but it's amazing how much time that you can waste and how little time you can perform a task in if you just get it arranged in your mind and do it and then move on to something else.
So, what happened in 1970 that made you want to run for governor?
Well, I guess it was just the fact that, you know, I had the experience of 8 years in the legislature, 2 years as a speaker. I felt like that, you know, I was well versed in all facets of state government. I felt like, you know, it was an easy time for us in many ways, and I had gotten along very well with Governor Ellington, and I'd gotten along very well with Governor Clement when he was governor. And I really felt like that I could, manage the money of the state wisely. And I think that's always been one of the principal reasons that have wanted to and have been involved in government. There is in fact just tremendous waste and fraud and abuse from the very top. The city, the county, the state, and of course the federal government is the worst offender.
And you were 30, let's see, when the election happened at the beginning of November.
33 during the governor's race, and I tried to convince people that Alexander the Great had conquered the world by age 33, and there were several other notables, but it didn't work because apparently I still looked 20. And I actually had people tell me, son, you need to go home and age a little bit.
Who were your opponents in that in the Republican primary in that 1970
well,
election?
Winfield Dunn, of course, was the winner. Maxie Jarman was one of the candidates. Claude Robertson was one from Knoxville, and the gentleman from Maryville. He'll have to forgive me, but Hubert Patty.
I was going to say I was 3, and I don't remember it either. But in any event, Hubert Patty was the name. So Winfield Dunn came out the victor in that primary in 1970. Did you support him then in the general election?
I did. I campaigned in conjunction with his campaign and in a way independently at my own expense for him from the primary until the general election in November. And he became the first Republican governor in 50 years.
I seem to recall a pretty funny story. Maybe we can take a sidetrack here and tell it about Winfield Dunn and an altercation that might have occurred during that maybe before that election, and some advice you gave him about that. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
When he went to the lumber company?
Yes.
Winfield. Well, let me say first of all, he is a great human being, thoroughly honest and capable, and he did us a good job as governor of Tennessee. But Winfield was in some ways could have passed for an East Tennessee hillbilly. He had a little bit of temper, and he needed one time, he left his dental office and went to a lumber yard, and he needed a piece of wood. He described it as about 3 feet long, about 4 inches wide, and about a ½ inch thick or something. So the place was busy, and so he put in his order, and then all these other people were getting waited on, and they were bringing their stuff out, and finally he got a little disturbed, and he walked up to this counter and he said, "Say, when are you gonna get my lumber?" And this fellow took issue with that behind the counter, and so they got into a big yammering contest, and I think the fellow actually pulled a gun out on him, and Winfield grabbed the gun and just conked him with his fist. And so during the general election campaign, I got a frantic call from some of his managers in Shelby County and said, "Listen, we're about to get hit with this terrible story. Winfield slugged some guy." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And he told me what happened. I said, "Oh my goodness!" He said, "Don't you wait and let them release that." I said, "You guys get this out." I said, "This will make him thousands and thousands of votes up here in East Tennessee." But he he was a good governor and an interesting fellow, and I used to tease him that, you know, I had to teach him to speak East Tennessee when he came up there.
And eventually, I guess after he won the general election, you went to work for him, right?
I did. He appointed me as Commissioner of Conservation.
And what was the purview of the Department of Conservation in those days?
Well, it had many facets. You know, it had one thing. It had the division of mine reclamation, and I guess that got the most attention. And we formulated. The governor and I hired a couple of Vanderbilt professors from the Department of Engineering and Department of Environmental Engineering. And we set about to formulate a new law to govern the reclamation of coal mines and other mines in Tennessee. And eventually we got it passed, and it became the law of the land. And it really was the first effective reclamation that had ever been passed in Tennessee. But it was controversial, as you can imagine that subject would be. And there was one of the things that I noticed when I first took office was that within the Division of State Parks or within the department, there was really no cost accounting in place. And so we developed a system of cost accounting that I think greatly benefited the state parks and every other division of the department. And became a member of the Oil and Gas Board, and we had that division that regulated the oil and gas industry in the state. And there was beginning to be a considerable development up in East Tennessee, and some oil wells, some gas wells.
When you were in the legislature, you were traveling back and forth to Nashville. You told us, did you have to move when you became the Commissioner of Conservation?
I did. And we moved to Brentwood, Tennessee, and lived there during the time that I was commissioner.
How long was that?
Well, I was commissioner for about 2 years, and then the president, there was a vacancy on the Tennessee Valley Authority Board, and it's a presidential appointment, and the governor and Senator Baker and Senator Brock were all in place, and they submitted my name in nomination to the president, and he appointed me to the board. And I went through, of course, the confirmation process, and it was an interesting process. And to get back to civility and cooperation between the political parties, Senator Baker was on the committee that conducted the confirmation hearing, but Senator Edmund Muskie from Maine was the chairman, and Senator John Sherman Cooper from Kentucky was the ranking member. And Senator Baker convinced Chairman Muskie to allow Senator Cooper to preside over my hearing, which could probably not happen today in the United States Senate for a committee chairman of either party to allow the ranking member of the other party to preside over a hearing of a presidential appointee from the other party. And so that was an interesting facet of that venture.
What president was it that appointed you
Nixon,
to the...
President Nixon.
And I think are there 9 members of that board now? Is that right? The TVA board has not?
Well, now it does, but at that time it had 3 members.
Okay. So it was not as large then as it is now. And when you were appointed, who were the other two members of that board?
Aubrey Wagner and Don McBride from, and Chairman Wagner he was the chairman of the board, and he'd been there for many years. And the great issues of the day, of course, I was sworn in 1972, and I guess it was 73 that the Arab oil embargo hit us. And it had a tremendous impact on our lives in the 7-state area, because TVA used 40 million tons of coal. And within a few months, the price of a ton of coal had gone from $2.32 a ton to $10 a ton. And with using 40 million tons per year, you can see that this put a tremendous expense back to the ratepayers in Tennessee.
These two jobs that we've been talking about, Commissioner of Conservation and the TVA board, did you have to devote your full time to those, or were you able to continue to practice law?
Oh no, it was both were full-time jobs.
Do you think that the 8 years you spent in private practice and your training as a lawyer enabled you to do a better job at those two things than you would otherwise have been able to do?
Oh, yeah, there's no question in my mind, and I think the fact that I had started out as an engineering student and had that year of engineering chemistry and that year of engineering math and all those subjects, because there were times when, you know, the lingo, especially at TVA, would have been beyond my educational background, you know, for the business courses and all those things, the money and banking courses and all that I had. So, yeah, I don't think there's any question, but all of those things contributed to being able to do a better job than I could have done, maybe.
What about the dealings with nuclear power while you were on the TVA board? How was that?
When I went to TVA, there were 4 nuclear plants that had been approved, that had been started.
They'd already been started before you?
Yes, and we voted not too long after I went there on the Hartsville plant, and I voted in favor of it. Before,
let me ask you a question before you go on. The 3 people who were on the board had the authority by their vote to approve the construction of new nuclear power plants. Is that what you're saying?
They did, but after the Self-Financing Act of 1959, TVA had a set debt limit, and actually needed to go back to the Congress to ever get that raised. And so when the 6th and 7th plants came before the board, I was not in favor of starting those 2 plants. There were several reasons. Number one, we were going to exceed our $5 billion debt limit if we started those plants, which means I thought we should have gone back to the Congress before we started them, knowing that we couldn't build them within that debt limitation, and get it raised to a point. Additionally, the cost of fuel for those plants was spiraling. I mean, it was going up, up, up. The cost of construction itself was spiraling. And in addition to that, you had I was in favor of the nuclear option. But I felt like that at TVA we had wonderful experiences in the past with engineering feats They had done some great construction work with the building of the dams and the building of the coal-fired plants. But this was an entirely new arena. And I have compared it to playing basketball. You know, if you got one good team, you can play people. If you got two good teams, you can play better teams and make a full schedule. But if you've got three good teams and three that are not so good, then you know you need to take a look at what you're doing, and that's exactly what we had in the construction business. We had some wonderful people that were on these jobs that still weren't completed, and we were stretching the construction forces mightily. And a lot of mistakes were made, and a lot of work was not up to snuff, that didn't meet muster. And I had internally in TVA some people that I had known for a long time who were engineers in the field, and they were giving me information about that. And so I did not vote to build those last two plants. They were started, and then a subsequent board, as it's now history, they abandoned the Hartsville plant, and they abandoned all after Hartsville.
So you voted against it, and it was a 2-to-1, I take it,
Yes.
in favor of building the. You voted in favor of Hartsville. What would the next one?
And the first four were already approved. I voted in favor of Hartsville, and then did not vote for the last two.
Was that one of those? Was one of those Phipps Bend?
Yes.
Was one of them? What was the other one? I don't. Was it Brown's Ferry?
No, it was Yellow Creek.
Yellow Creek. So any of those, the first four that you were talking about, or Hartsville, or Phipps Bend, or Yellow Creek, any of them in operation today?
The first four?
Any of the 7?
Oh, sure.
Oh,
Well,
the first four, are the first four in operation?
Well, I tell you, they come and go, and sometimes they take units offline because they've got problems, and I don't know exactly which units are operational today.
But the first four were built to completion and did operate, whether they're operating this
Yes.
minute or not, they did operate. And Hartsville, Phipps Bend, and Yellow Creek never
got off the. And in the process, in the dismantling, the reactor was already at Phipps Bend, the reactor was already at Hartsville, and basically, I don't know what TVA's indebtedness is today, but if it's $27 or $28 billion, somewhere in that neighborhood, with the dismantling of those three plants, we took a loss of about $10 billion. That's a part of that indebtedness. So we would have been far better off, even though I thought a mistake was made to start that many. I think we'd have been far better off to have completed all of them, because then we could get revenue back from them to repay the indebtedness.
How long was the term of the appointment for the TVA board?
9 years.
And how long did you stay there?
6 years.
What was the reason that you left?
Well, I had been in a minority position with 1/3 of the voting power, and let's see, I guess Watergate came along in '74, and so President Nixon, when a vacancy came open, never got to make an appointment, and President Ford never got to make an appointment. So we were down to 2 board members, and I think I got this sequence right. President Carter appointed a member, and soon thereafter appointed a second member. But And there were no, I had great respect for the other board members. Mr. Wagner and Mr. McBride were both engineers, both very competent and both very, very great Americans. But I felt that at TVA, the financial outlook was not what it should have been. I felt like the indebtedness was getting to be too great, and also we had the Environmental Protection Agency came along, and they were requiring TVA to do things that really did not make any sense. An example is at Kingston Steam Plant, the Environmental Protection Agency devised this strategy that they call the tall stack strategy, which means you build a taller smokestack, and so whatever pollutants come out of that stack, they would be dispersed as opposed to a low stack, and when they get back to Earth, they are more dispersed and not as harmful. TVA spent about $125 million building and putting in place that control. But before it was ever put into use, EPA came back and said, hey, you know this tall stack strategy we spoke about ain't gonna work. You gotta do this. And so they required a whole new generation of equipment, and which was gonna be at a cost of about $500 million per year was the total cost to the people who were paying the bills and paying the electric bills in the TVA area. So I thought it was a good time to get back to doing what I had done before, and I did that. I went back to the practice of law, and I took a little sabbatical, and I farmed for a year or thereabouts, and then I opened the law office in July the 1st, 1979.
We'll pick up there. We're going to take a very short break, and we'll pick up with the reinstitution of your law practice when we have a new tape.